Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome to lesson 8 of Straight Path Academy Arabic, volume 1, reading Arabic letters. If you've completed the course up to this point, then that means you learned 8 Arabic letters and 5 Arabic symbols. And you've already finished 1/3 of this course. So inshallah, now is a good time to be introduced to the fact that some Arabic letters sound very similar to one another. I'd say that there are about 5 pairs of Arabic letters that somewhat resemble one another. And a simple way that we can differentiate them from one another is to understand that in each of these pairs, one of them is basically heavier than the other. It's really as simple as that. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about, let's take a look at my name, which is Sajid. If I'm going to write Sajid in English, I'm going to start with the letter S. Sajid. Another Arabic name that sounds similar to Sajid is the name Saleh. So Saleh would also begin with the letter S. However, in Arabic, these two names begin with different letters. The name Sajid starts with the letter Sin, which we learned in lesson 5. However, the name Saleh begins with the letter Sad, which we're going to learn in this lesson, inshallah. Before moving forward, I really want to stress that students who are learning how to read should not obsessively focus on pronouncing all of the letters perfectly. In fact, this can be extremely counterproductive and discouraging, and quite frankly, unnecessary. At this stage of your Arabic learning, we simply want you to get an idea regarding how these letters sound, which in the case of the Sin and the Sad, they both sound similar to the letter S. And then beyond that, we just want you to know that the letter Sad is different from the letter Sin in that the Sad is heavier. That is sufficient at this point. And there's 2 ways that we are going to achieve this together, inshallah, when we complete the exercises. Firstly, when it comes to the transliteration, as we already learned, for the letter Sin, we're simply going to write an S. However, for the letter Sad, we're also going to write an S, but we're going to add a small dot underneath. So this will remind us that yes, the letter Sad, it sounds like S. However, that additional dot will remind us that the Sad is a bit heavier. So you can think of it like a little additional weight that you're adding to the letter S. And then a second thing I'd like you to remember is, generally speaking, how each of these letters sound when there is a fetha. Now, of course, we learned that the fetha sounds like A. So we write an A for the fetha. However, we want to pronounce the Sin and fetha as Sa, similar to how you would pronounce the S and A in the beginning of the word sand. However, when it comes to the fetha, along with the letter Sad, we want to pronounce this more similar to the S and A in the word saw. So think about that. Even in English, the way we pronounce the S and A in sand is different than the way we pronounce the S and A in saw. Sand has a bit of a lighter S and the A sounds more like A, whereas saw has a bit of a heavier S and the A sounds more like aw. So you have S versus S and A versus aw. Therefore, you can consider pronouncing the Sin and fetha more like Sa versus the Sad and fetha more like Saw. Sa, Saw. And again, the goal here is not to be perfect in our pronunciation. The goal is to differentiate between these 2 letters, understanding that the Sin sounds like a lighter S, whereas the Sad sounds like a heavier S. And it really is as simple as that. So with that said, today we're going to learn our 9th Arabic letter, which is the letter Sad. And as we explained, the letter Sad sounds like a heavy version of S, such as in the English word saw. And to show that this S is heavier than the Sin, we're going to just add a dot underneath the S when we do the transliteration for the letter Sad. And an example of a word in Arabic that begins with the letter Sad is the name of a prophet, alayhi salam, Saleh. This is how the letter Sad looks when it's written alone, and this is how it looks in the beginning, middle, and end of a connection. And perhaps something that we can compare the shape of the Sad to, that could help us remember it, is that it looks kind of like the shape of a snail. If you can imagine, this is the shell of the snail, and this is where it pokes its head out. So let's say that the shape of the letter Sad is similar to a snail. So let's go straight to the exercise and see if we can identify the letter Sad. So let's try number 5 together. First, we need to identify the letter. Which letter did we say looks kind of similar to a snail? That would be the letter Sad. So for the letter Sad, we're going to write an S, and we're going to put a dot underneath to signify that it's a heavy S, heavier than the letter Sin. Next, let's identify the haraka. That is the Fetha, so we're going to write an A for the Fetha. And remember, we mentioned that the letter Sad with a Fetha is pronounced more like Saw versus Sa. So it's pronounced more like Saw as in chainsaw versus Sa as in sand. So the Sad and Fetha would be pronounced like Saw. Let's identify the next letter. This has that same snail-like shape. That is, again, the letter Sad. So we'll write an S with a dot underneath. And the haraka we see underneath the letter Sad is the Kesra. So we're going to write an I for the Kesra. So the Sad along with the Kesra, we would pronounce like Si. Let's go to that last letter. Again, we see that snail-like shape. This is the letter Sad. So we'll write an S with a dot underneath. And then as for the haraka, we see 2 Kesras, meaning it has tenween. So we write an I for the first Kesra, and then N for the second Kesra. So we would pronounce this like Sin, Sin. So all together, these 3 letters and their harakat would be pronounced Sa, Si, Sin. Sa, Si, Sin. So that does it for this video. Inshallah, we will complete lesson 8 in the next one. Keep up the great work. Jazakumullahu khairan. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.